Hi, everyone, and welcome to Excel Virtually Global for 2024. My name is Steve Kraynak, and I'm one of the directors here at Some Product. I'm based in the United States, and I'm happy to share with you my technique for creating custom map charts and showing an easy way that you can get the coordinates for your own chart. So perhaps you have a floor plan for a building, and this is going to show you a way to easily find all the coordinates for data points if you have data relating to that floor plan. So let's take a look at kind of what I mean about that. So here's an example of a floor plan, and this is actually a bubble chart in Excel. And I have the floor plan set up as the background, and you can see that it's kind of interactive, so I can check a checkbox to either show or hide a series of data. And I'm going to show all about how to do that and show you some tricks to help you make it easier. So the session summary is, number one, there's a lot of setup involved with using or getting coordinates for your own map chart, and it can be very tedious. I'm going to take the tedium out of that. And then we're going to do that by using some cool, pretty nice dynamic arrays. They're not very super complex, but extremely handy. And then I'll give tips for setting up either an XY scatter chart or a bubble chart so you can get the best results. And then finally, we'll look at how to use these coordinates and also make a 3D map out of it. So I want to start off by showing what I mean by the tedium of trying to do this just by yourself in Excel. And you can manually, of course, take a floor plan and figure out the coordinates for each one of the points where you want to have data on there. One way that you might want to do it, I'll show here, is so here I'm copying the image of my floor plan, and I have an XY scatter chart over here, and I'll just set that floor plan to be the background of the chart. So I've double clicked on the plot area, and then I went to the fill section and go to picture or texture fill and press the clipboard button, and that puts my image as the background of my chart. Now this is not really the exact dimensions I need, but it's fine to demonstrate the tedium of doing this. So let's say I wanted to get the coordinates for each of the rooms that are on the map here. I could have a table on the side with the room name and the X location and the Y. And I can look at my chart. So for example, the room that's at the top is room 109. And I can look down and see that the X value for that is around 5.5. And the Y value is around 9. So I can go over to my table and type in 109 for the room, and then 5.5, and then type in 9. And you can see now I have a dot there. So, that coordinate looks pretty good. I'll do another one. 107 is the next room down here. It looks like the X value is about 4.8. And the Y value is maybe just 8.1, seems good. And there you can see I have a dot up there. So that's it's a successful way I can get my coordinates, but going through and typing all the room numbers and eyeballing each one can be extremely tedious. So I'm going to show you an easier way to do it. Okay. So there are a few steps in this, and the first one is to properly size your map. So what I mean by this is think about the size that you want your chart to be. In particular, you want the range of the axis to be considered. So in mine, I want to have a square chart, and I decided for my purposes, the granularity that I need is if I do 0 to 40, that will be enough. So what I'm going to do is switch back to Excel and show you how this can be done. So first off, I want to create a square grid in Excel that matches the size that I think I want. So I want a square. So I decided 40 by 40 would be good. So I basically just created a block of cells in here that's 40 by 40. And I did that by sizing the 40 columns to be 40 pixels. And then I sized the 40 rows to also be 40 pixels. So basically each cell within my square is a square, and each one is 40 by 40 pixels. Now I can take my map and impose that over top of the square here. And this map is pretty square itself, so it'll fit pretty nicely, but you may have a map that's not exactly square, and you can actually, this one's not exactly square either, so it hangs over a little bit on the right side, but I'm going to just crop it a bit. So I'll go to picture, crop, and then I'll just crop this edge of it since there's really nothing in the map. There's nothing in the map there. And now I have my image within the square. So let me just zoom out a tiny bit. And what I want to do is copy this for use later. So in this case, I could just copy my image because it's a square. If your image was, let's say, not really fitting in there exactly the right way, you could, maybe it's a little bit smaller like this. You could uh, fill in some of those cells so that you don't see the grid lines. And then the key part is you want to take a screenshot of the box that you've set up in Excel, and that way you'll know that the image you have is exactly the right size for your chart. So I'm going to just hit Windows, Shift, and S on my keyboard. And now I'm just drawing a box around my range. And it's probably not perfect, so I might be a little bit more careful if I was doing this for real, but in this case, just demonstrating, it's fine. Now, to get the coordinates, we want to go into our grid, and we can actually type in behind this map, and then we're going to use a formula to pull out all the coordinates. So let's see how we can do that. First thing is I need to be able to see the cells that are behind my image. To do that, it's just a matter of setting it to transparent. So I put 50% transparency on my image, and then I'm going to go in and I clicked on a cell that's outside of my image, so otherwise it would just select the image. And now I can use my arrow keys to move my selection down in behind the image. And now I can just type in the room number. So behind room number 109, I found a cell and I typed in 109. Behind 107, I just typed in 107. And I'll just do a couple more here. 105. And let's do 108. And 110. So there, very quickly, I just put in 5 room numbers. And you can see over here on the right, I have a range set up, and I'll zoom in there a little bit. And you can see that those room numbers that I typed in show up in a list, and I magically get the coordinates. So all I did was type in the room numbers, but my formula here is pulling out the values. So now I'll have a list of all my x, y coordinates, and I can just continue going through and typing the room numbers behind my image there, and I'll get the full list. So how do we do that? So let me switch back into PowerPoint and show how that's done. So this I talked about just typing in the names of the rooms behind the map. And the magic happens because of dynamic arrays. So here I have a dynamic array formula, and you're free to use this. Basically, this just takes the range that you put in, which is the range of the grid that you set up, and it pulls out all the room numbers and the XY coordinates. Now, I have this broken down in a simpler way in Excel, and I can explain all the different steps that are happening here. So here's a smaller version of my grid, and this just is used to explain the formula. So I broke it out in the first sheet that I showed you. It's just one big formula, and here I broke it out into a bunch of helper cells to make it a little bit easier to understand. So the first thing that it does is it calculates the first row of the grid just to find where that is located on the sheet, and the first column of the grid. Now, if you started your grid in cell A1, you wouldn't need to worry about this because you would know it's always starting at row 1 and column 1. But to make it more flexible so you can put that grid anywhere on the sheet, it calculates the first row and the first column. And it just does that very simply it takes the row of the range. So whatever cell, but this is dynamic array again. So the range is the entire grid, and it just finds the minimum row that's in there. And then likewise, we find the minimum column that's in there. So the next step is to use those ranges, use those values, and then excuse me, pull out the entire grid and create the coordinates while we do that. So I just have typed in A, B, C, and D over here, but you can see the results of my formula over here give me A and then the coordinates 1 and 10 for this first one. The X is 1 and the Y is 10. And it does that for every cell in the grid. And I'll show you how it does that. The first thing is it looks at the grid for every cell. It checks whether it's blank. If it is blank, then I don't specify anything here, so it'll return a 0. And then if it's not blank, we're going to take the value that was typed in there. So in this case, we want to turn it into text. So if the rooms are names, then they already are text. You wouldn't need this. But if you want to use room numbers, then you need to convert the number to text because we're going to be combining this text and splitting it apart later to get our list. So I get the value that was typed into the grid, and I put a vertical bar, and then I'm going to figure out the coordinates. So the first one here is the x coordinate. So it basically finds the column of each value, and then it subtracts the number that we had for the first column of the grid, and then adds 1. So if we take an example here, this one, the range, or sorry, the column of this one would be 3, and then we subtract 3, and we would have 0, but we want to always have a positive number here, so we add 1, and we know that the x value for that is going to be 1. So we do that for each of these. Similarly, we calculate the row number, so it's just the number of rows in the range minus the row that we have for each cell, and then we're just going to add on the number that we had for the first row. So for example, this one, there are 10 rows in the range. We're on row 4, so 10 minus 4 is going to give us 6, and then we add on 10 minus 4, and then we add on 4. So it's basically giving us a 10, and then we can see that's the coordinate. All right, the next step is to pull all those values from that grid. And there's a simple unique formula that will do that. So we use the unique function, but we want these to all show up in one column. So we have a nice list. So we use the toCol function. So we do toCol of that grid, and that gives us a single column. And then we use unique to just pull out all the unique values. And this gives us a list of all the ones that we actually typed in. And then there will be a 0, assuming there are some empty cells that are in there. The next step is to filter out the zeros. So here we just simply use the filter function on our list, and we just filter out anything. So we basically keep anything that's not equal to 0. And you can see we have our short little list here. And then the next step is to split these text values into the room name or number and the x and y value. So we can do that with using a combination of text split and text join. So you might say, well, why do I need to do the text join, and why not just do the text split? So if I did text split with a vertical bar of this range over here, shouldn't I be given the result of each row split out like this? And that would be nice, and it seems like it should do that, but it actually doesn't behave like that. So I have an example here where if I just did text split of that range, it just gives me the first value in each one of the cells. I could do text split of each row in that range separately, and that would work. But to combine it together, I can first join all the values in that range using a semicolon as the row delimiter, and then, using a semicolon, and then I can split them up using the semicolon as a row delimiter, and it gives me the range. So I have my room and my x and y values. Okay, the next step is to convert the x and y values to numbers. So in the previous step, excuse me, working with the text functions, we end up with results that are text, and we need to make sure that for the chart, they're actually treated as numbers. So to do that, we're going to treat each column separately. So we use an index function. So we get the column 1 using index of that range and use a 1. And then for the next one, we do 2. And here we're going to wrap this in number value, and that's going to convert it to a number for us. Now, you might ask, why not use the n function to convert these? And the reason is that if you use the n function on a range like this, it will just result in a single value. And I found that the number value will return a range as well. So it's more aware of dynamic arrays, and the n function is not. So we do the same thing for the x and y columns. We just use the index to get the right column from our original range, which is over there, and then we use the number value to convert those to numbers. And then putting it all together, this is the one big formula, and I'll just expand it out here. And you can see I'm using the let function just to make it easy. So each one of those steps is now embedded inside this let function, so we can see the first row is calculated, the first column is calculated. Then we pull out all the values from our grid and put zeros or blanks where we don't have a value. And then we get the first list, which is our unique list of those converted to a column. And then list 2 is our filtered list. List 3 is where we split the text up into 3 columns. And then we use HStack, and we actually will take the first column, which is our room number, the second column, which is our x, and the third column, which is our y, and just basically convert those back into a single range. And that's just called our xy nums. And you can see by the highlighting here, it's a single range returned by that one formula. Okay. So I'm going to show how we can actually verify that our coordinates are correct. And basically just going to use a simple XY scatter plot to do that. So now let's switch back and look at our map again. Sorry, the coordinates here. So I could go through and continue to type in all the values and get my list. Basically, the point of it is to get your full list of coordinates, and then we're going to copy and paste and use that somewhere else. So we're going to paste that so we can combine it with our actual data that we want to show on the chart. But before we do that, we want to just make sure that we got the numbers right. And what I've done here is I have a copy of that sheet where I just have typed in numbers or values behind each of the room numbers in my grid. And I'm going to add an XY scatter chart to here, and then we'll just make sure that the coordinates look good. So go to charts, insert, scatter, and it doesn't do a good job detecting where my values are in this case. So I'm going to go into the select data dialog and just remove all the series that it detected because I don't like any of those. And I'll add my own. So for the series name, I'll just click on the header of the room column. It'll be called room. And then for my X values, I simply select all the values in my X column. For Y, I select all the values in my Y. I don't need to worry about this bubble column for now. And now I have my series, and it looks pretty good. I have my chart, and there's obviously no map on there, but the first thing I want to do is just do a little formatting. So I've selected the dots. So this is selecting my series, and I just did that so that I can make the dots a little bit bigger and make it easier to see. So I went into the data series. I picked on the fill in line. I chose marker, and then marker options. I choose built-in, and I just increase the size of those. So now we can see our dots a little bit better. And I'm going to grab my image down here. So I just selected it and copied it. Now again, I double click on the plot area to bring up this plot area options. select picture or texture fill, and choose clipboard. Now I have my map shown on the chart. Sorry, Excel's not updating very well there. Let me just do my little trick. Sometimes if your chart doesn't repaint properly, you can scroll away from it and scroll back, and Excel will fix things up for you. So now I can look at this, and if I see any dots that I don't like the position of, I can go in and retype or type the room number in a different spot in my grid over here on the left and reposition it. But before I do that, there's a few things you want to check on the chart. So the first is to make sure that the shape of the chart is a square. In my case, it could be a rectangle, but in my case, it's a square. So in order to check that, there's a couple different ways. You could put it on top of your grid and make sure you size it right. I think a little bit easier way is just to insert a shape. So I'm inserting a square here, and I'll just set it to, so it'll be an 8-inch by 8-inch square. Okay. And then just to make it easier to see, because I'm going to put this in front of my chart, I'm going to set it to no fill and set the shape outline to be a little bit brighter color so it's easier to see. And then go into my properties and set it so that it locks the aspect ratio. So I know when I resize this, it will always stay as a square. Now I can move this and I can put it in front of my chart, and I'll just resize it a little bit. Actually, I don't need to. I can keep it the way it is. Now I can resize my chart back there so that my plot area fits right underneath the square. And then I'll know that my plot area is also a square. And you can kind of see from doing that, the map looks a little bit better. It was kind of skewed before that. So now I'm done with that little square shape I put in. I do want to make sure that the dimensions of my chart don't change and throw it out of whack. So I'm going to go back into the chart options. I just double clicked on the chart area and want to choose the size and properties button. And I want to go to lock aspect ratio. And that will make sure that if it does change size, it'll keep that scale and my plot area will stay as a square. And I'm also going to go into the properties. I really don't want this thing to change size, and I typically do this with all my charts. I'll go and set the properties so it moves but doesn't size with cells. So then if I resize columns or delete or add rows, my chart will stay the same shape, same size, but it may move, and that's okay. Now it's a good time where you can go and fine tune the position of these dots by changing the coordinates. So I'll just show an example here. So this 1A, so room 1A isn't really in the location where I want it. So I can go back to my grid over here. And again, I clicked outside of it so that I can move my mouse selection or move my cell selection. And I deleted 1A that I typed in there. And now I'm going to type in 1-A again. And now my dot, it's just moved slightly in my chart, but I like that location better, and I think it's more accurate. So now I have the dots where I want them, and I can take my coordinates, and I would just copy these and then go somewhere and paste them. So I actually have the data that I'm actually going to show on a real chart over here. I've actually already pasted in my coordinates here, but that way I'll have them in a fixed spot, and I don't need that other sheet again. And it's also nice because they can be added as a table, where in that dynamic array formula, that can't be in a table. It would have to just be a range. So if I need to refer to these, which I will, then it's just nice to have them in a table. Okay. So we've created a simple chart to test our values. I showed inserting the map chart as a background. I've shown setting the, oh no, I didn't show this. So setting the axis bounds to match the range size is important. So back in my chart that I added here, the axes, you want to make sure that the minimum and maximum match your data. So this one automatically just worked out, but I'm going to manually type those. Whoops. Should have put a 40 there. So I've just manually typed in 0 to 40 as my minimum and maximum for the y-axis, and I'll do the same for the x-axis because I want my chart to always stay in those dimensions. If my data was such that Excel automatically set the bounds of my axis, it would kind of skew things and wouldn't look right. So now I have my dimension or my bounds fixed in there. And let's just do a couple more things to clean up the chart so I don't need these grid lines to show up in there. So I just selected those and got rid of those. And now I have really just my map. I really don't even need these axes numbers on here anymore. And you can just put the title on there as you want. You could add a legend. You may actually need to do the resizing of the plot area with the square if any of that has changed the dimensions of it, but it still looks pretty good in this case. Okay, so here I showed how to fine-tune the XY coordinates already. Again, it's just once you create that little test chart, you can go back to your grid and delete or retype any of the room numbers. If you're using a bubble chart, there are some other helpful things that you can do. So number one is that when you create the bubble chart, actually this applies to the XY scatter as well. If you had a little bit of offset that you wanted to add for your map just to line things up right, you can just go in and there's an offset control in the properties. I didn't need to do that on mine. If you size things properly, you shouldn't need to do this. But if you get things that are really close and you just want to tweak it a tiny bit, you can increase or decrease the offset left, right, top, or bottom, and that will just move the image in the back of the chart a little bit. If you're using a bubble chart, I found those bubbles tend to start out by default to be larger than I would want. So I always go in and I set the bubble size down a bit. In the example in the screenshot here, I set it to 50%. And then you can also set some transparency on the color if you want to see behind so the room numbers are shown on my map, but if I put a bubble in front of them, it can obscure the room number. Another thing you can do to avoid that is to use a data callout. So in this one, you can see I've used data callouts, and the data callout is actually showing the room number from my data and not the actual values that are in there. So next I'll show how we can put all this together. So you can add multiple series to your chart, which is really useful if you want to show different kinds of information on the same map. And that's what I have an example of here. So switching back to Excel. So here I have my chart. This is actually a bubble chart, and it's been set up similar to what I've just showed by adding my map as the background and setting my coordinate or my x and y axes to the right values and making it a square and double checking that my coordinates were good. I've copied my coordinates over to a coordinates table here, and then I have my data table. So my data table in this example, I use the XLOOKUP to just bring in the X and Y values directly into this table. And I've done that because I'm calculating the X and Y axis or values for 3 different series, and I'm doing it with a slight little offset so that the bubbles don't overlap each other. But just real quickly, I'll show the XLOOKUP. So here we're using XLOOKUP, and it's looking up the unit from this table, and it's looking across the unit column of the XY coordinates table. And then in this case, it's returning the X value here, and it does that all the way down. And similarly for the Y, except in this case, it's returning the Y value instead of the X value. So now let me show what I mean about adding a slight little bit of offset. So in this chart, I mentioned I have 3 series and they all relate to the same rooms. And I could have just used the X, Y values that I had in the column where I just showed you, but all those bubbles would overlap each other. So I have here something called a bubble offset. And if I set it to 0, you can see this basically means that all the bubbles are using the exact same X and Y coordinates. but I decided that's not good because I don't want them to cover each other up. So I just put in a little offset addition or subtraction to each of those XY values. So if I set this to 0.7, I can show you, well, you can see that the bubbles now no longer cover each other. They might overlap a bit, but that's okay. They're still visible. And if we look at how I set up the data, so I have this column for each one of the tasks that are at my apartment complex. So lease renewal is one thing that might be coming up. HVAC maintenance may be due, and then a safety inspection may be due. And I've set this calculation up so that if the renewal is due very soon, I give it a value of 2. If it's due like sometime next month, then I give it a value of 1. And if it's beyond 2 months from now, I give it a value of 0. And this is going to make it so that I get a larger bubble for things that are due very soon and a smaller bubble for things that are due in a month. And then if it's got a 0, those things really are they're due, but later on, so I don't need to worry about those right now. And I do the same thing for the HVAC and the safety. Now for the offset, you can see I've calculated X and Y coordinates. So this X and Y coordinate column that you see here are for the lease data. And then I've done X and Y for the HVAC data, and also X and Y over here for the safety data. And it simply adds or subtracts that offset just to move the bubble a little bit away from the coordinate that I started with. So in the case of the lease, it adds it on to both the X and Y. So it's going to move it up and to the right. In the case of HVAC, it's adding it to the X. So it's moving it to the right, but it's subtracting it from the Y, so it'll bring it down a bit. And then for safety, I think it's subtracting from both. So it'll bring it down a little bit and move it to the left a little bit. And then that keeps them from overlapping each other on the chart. Now I've also added a little bit of interactivity here. And I did that by creating a new range. So my actual data is still in that table over there, but I wanted to just make a range, and this is the bubble value in my chart. And I can show that if I open up the select data dialog for one of these, you can see that the series name is over there in the table, the X and Y, and then the bubble value is outside there. And what I did that for is so that I can do a simple calculation using this checkbox. So the checkboxes in Excel just give me a true or false value. If it's true, I can use it in a calculation, and here it's simply multiplying the true or false value by the actual value in my table. So if it's true, then it will be just multiplying all those values by 1, and I'll just get the actual value that's in the table. If it's false, it will multiply everything by 0, and I'll have a list of zeros here. And that will mean that my bubbles just kind of disappear, because bubbles that are 0 just don't have a bubble and they don't show up. So you can see when I unchecked any of these boxes, the related series will disappear from the chart. So it's just a simple way that you can add some interactivity, and those are all the tips I have. So hopefully that's useful. I'm going to show now, moving on, how we can make a 3D chart or a 3D map. So this is switching gears a little bit, but you can now create a 3D map, and this is useful if you have data that has a time component to it. So in the example I have data from, if you imagine that this map related to a healthcare facility, and healthcare facilities really need to keep track of whether infections are happening for their residents. So it might just be that the residents have some kind of cold, or maybe they have COVID, and they do need to keep track of that to make sure that they can control the spread. But healthcare facilities will also track things like whether the patient's got an IV, and if that insertion point of the IV got infected, they need to really keep track of that. And that helps them to make their practices better, because if they have an infection, they can look for the root cause and figure out how to prevent that in the future. So let's go in back to Excel and see how we can do that. So the first thing is, I'll just show my data here. So I have data, and there's a column that tells what kind of infection that they're tracking. There's a date for each one. There's a room number. And then I have my X and Y coordinates, and I brought these in from my coordinates table in a similar way using the XLOOKUP that I did before. Now, to use a 3D map, you need to know where to find this type of map. Interestingly, you may not find it on the Insert tab, and it may not be near where you would expect to find near all the chart buttons. I have it here, but you may not find it there. If you can't find it or you don't remember what I'm going to show you, you can always just type in the search bar at the top and 3D map will come up, and then you can just start it directly from there. The other aspect of this is that the data needs to be added to the data model of Excel. So where you can find this 3D map button is on the data tab, and the data model button is this little green button. You may have it expanded and may say that it's the data model. But if you don't, then you can go into there and manage the data model. 3D map is right underneath there. So if you don't have Power Pivot enabled, then when you click one of those buttons, you'll be prompted to enable it. And then the first step in creating your 3D map is to add your data to the data model. So you need to have the Power Pivot tab of the ribbon, and you'll get that by clicking on the little green button I showed you on the data tab. Once you have it, you can put your selection anywhere within your table, go to Power Pivot and click Add to Data Model. Now this will add your table to the data model, and everything is good. You don't need to do anything else in here. You can just close that window, and now you're ready to create the 3D map. So again, to do that, you may be able to go to the Power Pivot. I'm not sure if the button will show here. I've added mine by customizing my ribbon, but you can certainly go back to that Manage Data button on the Data tab and then click on the 3D Map button. So this will launch 3D maps, and you have your choice of opening a tour or creating a new tour. Since this is our first one, I can just click on the tour one, and it brings up the 3D map window. This is a separate window in Excel where you can set this all up. So the first step is getting your map to be the background. So here, by default, you're going to get a globe or the world map, and tour one will be over here on the left-hand pane. And to switch out your map, you can click on the little gear button to change the scene options. You could also click up in the ribbon button, the ribbon on the scene options button, and then it has a map type where you click change, and then you can use a custom map. Now to do this, you need to have your map saved as a separate image file. So I've already done that, and I click the browse button, and then I can choose my facility map, and now it's been used as the background. So another thing you need to do in the map options here is to set the range. So for my X, it's going to go from 0 to 40. So I change the default coordinates from 0 to 40, and I'll do the same for the Y. And then you have some options here for scaling where you can stretch or shrink the image if you need to, and you can also apply an offset. If you've done everything correctly up to this point, using it at 100% scale and 0 offset should be fine. And you can check a box here to lock the coordinate values, and that will keep everything in line. So assuming your data has been calculated correctly, it's all good to go. And then you hit done. Now you have your map as your background, and it's simply a matter of pulling the fields into the correct part to add a chart. So there are a few different chart types you can use. You can use a clustered column, which is what I'll choose here. There's a stacked column. There's a bubble, and this will just put kind of bubbles on there. You can do a heat map, but for this purpose, a clustered column is just fine. And now it's a matter of dragging the fields from my data. So the field list shows me the list of columns that I had in my table, and you just need to know where to put these. So the first thing you need is a location. So that's my X and Y values. So I'm just going to drag X over to there and drag Y over to there. And then I need to specify what these values mean. So there's a drop-down list where you can choose what these values are. In this case, for a custom map, you're going to choose X coordinate for X, and then you're going to choose Y coordinate for Y. If you had GPS data, then you would probably use a different kind of thing here. You could use latitude and longitude, or if you had city names or country names, things like that, you can actually specify what those are. But in this case, it's a custom map, so X and Y is appropriate. And then there's a height. So the column height is going to be controlled by this events in my data. The events were how many infections occurred. So I'll add that to the height, and you can see that it starts building my chart over there. And then the category I have the different categories of infections. So I'll drag that over. And now I have all my infection types shown. And you can see it has a little legend here. I'll just resize that and move it a little bit out of the way. And then there's a time component. So I can just drag my date over to time. And now we're done with the field list. And now we can play this over time. So if there was an outbreak occurring, we can actually see it playing out over time on our chart. So the 3D map is plotting the data according to the time as time passes. And there are some other controls here, so you can reposition things. Maybe I don't want to have this date so big, or move it around to a different place. You can do all that. You can change the inclination of the chart, different things like that. You can zoom in and out. And then you can save this. So you can either click the create video button to create a video, or you can just do a screen capture if you just wanted to take a static image of one point in time. And there you go. That's all there is to creating a 3D map. You can close out the 3D map window. Now this won't appear anywhere in Excel, so you may not even realize that somebody had built a 3D map, but it's still there. So if you want to go back to it, you can go into to the data tab and click on that button. And now my tour is still there. So now I can just open it up directly and it's already built in. So I don't need to do that because I already explained everything, and that brings us to the end. So I'll just switch back to the presentation here. And okay, so I've shown how to set up your custom map in the 3D maps. I've shown about how to add all the fields over into the proper section of the chart in the 3D map, and then how to save your 3D map. So you can either save it as a video or just play it from within the 3D map window, or you can take a screen capture of it. And that's all there is to it. So hopefully that's been useful. Thank you for that. If you have any questions, then you can feel free to contact me. I'm available after the session. And again, my name is Steve Kraynak, a director at Some Product, and you can see my contact information there on the screen. So I'll be happy to connect with you. And then also, we appreciate if you would give us an evaluation. So you can either use the QR code here or use the URL that you can see on the screen, bit.ly/EVG2024 feedback. And then also I want to mention that the Microsoft Excel team is seeking research participants. And I can say from experience that Microsoft really values getting feedback from their customers. So this is your chance to participate. You can either, again, use the QR code that you see here, or the URL aka.ms/excelvgresearch. And that's it. So thank you again. I hope you enjoyed that.